Welcome to all our participants, to our executive members, our speakers today, and to members of the Jamaican Historical Society and friends of the society who may indeed become members. We, as Bernadette just said, have launched a webinar series, and it is our ambition to host one each month for the rest of this year. We are responding to two things, really. One is the COVID context that everybody is responding to by shifting our live in-person seminars and guest speakers and field trips. We have to move as much online as possible. So that's one powerful motivator. The second thing has to do with our theme itself, which we have called revisiting, or the unfinished project of decolonizing Jamaican history. And by this we mean that we are looking again into how people and events are represented and have been represented in colonial and post-colonial times. So I extend a very warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing from our two speakers, Dr. Shani Roper and Dr. Karl. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So with that, we are trying to keep a tight ship, and we would like to welcome Dr. Karl Watts, our first presenter. Dr. Watts is a lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, Mona, where his research interests include economic and business history, sports history, and landscape history. So Dr. Watts, please go ahead and share your research with us.
Bernadette, you can just allow me to share my screen. Thank you.
Hello, you are allowed. Can you go ahead?
All right. Thanks for those who came out today to participate in our first webinar. Hopefully, we'll be able to expand in the successive months. But at the moment, this is the beginning. Hopefully, I can set this thing off on good terms. So my presentation today is it's an article in progress. So this is the information based on that. It's about boxing in Jamaica, titled Physical Culture, Entertainment and Enterprise in a Colonial Space, 1892 to 1945. I only have 20 minutes, but let me just say that within the context of the webinar and the idea of decolonization of Jamaican history, I was thinking that my study may not exactly, sorry, someone's mic is on.
Someone's mic is on. Please unmute, please mute yourself. Go ahead, Karl, I'll try to see you.
Right. Yeah, so within the context of decolonizing our history, it's not necessarily, it's decolonizing within the context or within the context of the theme that we of this webinar. My study is more or less expanding the horizon of our history. As most of you know, that the historical, there's a lot about our history that we do not know. I mean, the information is there. It's it jumps out at you when you do your research, but not much has been written on various topics. Several topics have not been explored in Jamaican history, in various fields, various historical sections or so on, and especially when you're talking about historical topics, such as sports or economy or politics and the source and even the cultural aspects of it. Many of these areas have not been explored to a great extent. I mean, within the context of how the history has been written, we have tended over the years to establish a very narrow field in particular areas and then exhaust those particular areas, right? Wear them thin until they become, numb, and people lose, there's a certain level of disinterest that emerges because of weariness associated with these particular topics. So my area is, within the context of the webinar discussion, I'm looking primarily at how to expand this field and remove ourselves from the narrow boundaries of how we write Jamaican history, right? And explore as many themes or many topics as possible, that will give us a wider appreciation of what it means to be Jamaican. Right, so my area, the area I'm trying to expand is the area of sports history, right? Well, with this paper here, right? And I'm not saying that my thing is primarily obviously economics/business history, but my, the aspect of sports has a lot to do with culture and also economics and the business side of sports. So yeah, right, and the business side of sports. So yeah, so there's a cultural element, and there's also the business element, and that is how I was able to blend the two, because sports, as you know, is an extension of culture. I'm sure most of us are aware of the extension of sports into the areas of nationalism in our society. We see this come Olympics time and so on. But in the historiography, or based on how the history of sport has been written over the years, there has tended to be this narrow focus on cricket, right? In the wider historiography on sports. Even athletics hasn't gotten as much attention, and that's another prominent sport. Not even horse racing has gotten as much attention, especially in the context of, it being one of the longest lasting sports in the Caribbean, historically speaking. So my attempt now to expand this horizon is to focus on boxing in Jamaica, obviously. There's most of the boxing in itself was one of the more popular sports in Jamaica at the time. And this is popular on par with horse racing and with cricket, right? And in this paper, I'm looking primarily at the foundational aspects of boxing and how this manifested itself in the society and how it, was able to become such a popular sport, right? So I'm looking at it through three primary areas: physical culture, that's the cultural aspect of the sport and how it became embedded in the society, or to a level of appreciation, a certain level of appreciation for the sport, the idea of physical culture, the idea of entertainment, the entertainment industry, and also the enterprise. So the entertainment aspect along with the enterprise aspect, they can be intertwined to in some ways, but they are more or less separate based on the classifications and how it manifested itself during this period, right? Because generally when we're talking about physical culture, the idea, so remember, but there are two phases of sports, or two major classifications of sport when we're talking about modern sports as it manifested in Britain and in later North America since the 18th century, right? So physical culture would have tied itself more to the amateur sense of boxing. So the amateur side would be one, then there would be the professional side of the sport. And within the context of boxing and how it emerged, physical culture showed or demonstrated the idea of the manly art of self-defense. So this idea, I'm sure most of you know about how Jamaicans appreciate martial arts, the movies, and so on. Or we love hearing about, our favorite actors getting together to fight or to spar with each other through film and so on. Right, that idea of martial arts and the idea of defending yourself and being able to defend yourself, that was considered a manly ideal. And that is how it manifested itself in an amateur sense. So amateur in this sense doesn't mean that the person is not capable. It's just amateur just means you're doing it for a particular appreciation of the sport. So this is how boxing was able to manifest itself in Europe and in North America, even though it was always associated with prize fighting. But now we're talking about the Victorian era and so on, and the reformist ideologies that emerged. We're looking primarily at how it manifested itself in that particular period, the idea of the modern sport of boxing, as opposed to the more brutal, bare knuckle version that was eventually phased out towards the end of the 19th century. Right, so in Jamaica, because one of the things with this sport, most of you know that most of our sporting traditions are inherited. So cricket was inherited, athletics, most of the major sports in Jamaica were inherited from England. And these were ways that Jamaica was able to integrate itself into the ideals of modern sport. So I am looking more or less at how this took place. So physical culture would be one, and how the sport was became appreciated in an amateur sense, and then eventually this spilled over into the market scene, where it became more of a case for enterprise. So by the end of this period, not only was it associated primarily with the manly art of self-defense, it was also associated with the promotion of a healthy lifestyle. And this was one of the main proponents would have been T.K. Wint, the boxer, one of our most famous boxers during the interwar period and in the history of boxing generally. Right, so the idea of promoting a healthy lifestyle was normally associated with boxing, because remember, physical culture isn't just about boxing itself. You know, there are other sports like wrestling, bodybuilding, and gymnastics. I'm sure some of us can identify with those. Boxing has been phased out, but in the Jamaican context today, we still have situations where people are, emphasize going to the gym, or, whatever other exercises people engage in at the moment. But we do have this idea of a physical culture. So what I'm looking at more or less is how physical culture became a paramount feature of the society, and boxing was one of those sports that helped to promote this idea of the manly art of self-defense and the idea of a healthy lifestyle, which is sort of the norm now, but in different forms. All right, so the next aspect, well, this is just an example here, the extent to which it became prevalent, and the association initially with Mr. T.K. Wint, who was one of the premier instructors in physical culture. All right, the other aspect is entertainment. This now is tied to the idea of enterprise, entertainment, in the sense that, most of us identify with, the entertainment factor in most of our lives. It's a leisure, leisure activity, entertainment. So this would correspond with the expanding leisure market in Jamaica. Boxing was once considered primarily a sideshow, alongside charity, so boxing would take place at garden parties, charity events, concerts, and those other things, or the various boxing films that would be hosted by Jamaican cinemas. But later on, when boxing became more prominent, it eventually was acknowledged as one of the premier entertainment activities in the interwar period. Hence why the Entertainment Tax of 1923 acknowledges as much. And this is normally the association with prize fighting, because prize fighting would attract the large crowds. Right? So enterprise would refer to the prize fighting. It refers to the prize fighting aspect, obviously, because this is where the promoters and the boxers and the famous venues came to the fore, especially after 1918. There were elements of prize fighting before, obviously, but definitely after 1918, there were various individuals that came to the fore, motivated by the profit, the gain of profit, obviously, which would obviously go against the amateur values of the sport. This idea of money, the corruption of money, so yeah, and the gambling situation that would have emerged. The boxers, obviously, who come to the fore, obviously, were motivated by earning money. The boxers were primarily black, primarily from the working class, and primarily motivated by earnings and from the purse and the side bets. The numerous venues that came to the fore, especially in Kingston, they were created on the basis of the expansion in the entertainment sector and the various crowds that were demanding a certain entertainment product associated with boxing, right? So all of these developments in the area of enterprise through the promoters, the boxers, and the various venues as an indicator of the expansion of the leisure market in Jamaica and boxing's role in it made Jamaica one of the premier destinations for boxers in the circum-Caribbean region, including Panama and Cuba, right? And this facilitated transnational migration, and our association with Cuba also became prominent during this period. There was a significant interchange of boxers. Some would come and spend time here and even set up their own livelihoods here. So the paper that I'm writing at the moment is broken up into 3 parts. Genesis of a boxing culture, boom and bust in the 1920s, and how it became organized through the Jamaica Boxing Board of Control. Right, it's an organization that is still with us to this day, established in 1928, and it was led by the famous Norman Manley of Jamaica. He became president around 1929, 1930, and he held that post up until the end of this period, 1945. Despite the creation of the PNP, despite his role despite his profession as a lawyer and so on, he held steadfast to his role as president of the Boxing Board of Control, as an indicator of how important the sport was at the time. It's no longer as important, obviously, but we can see carryovers into the independence period, because Jamaica in 1973 is the only Caribbean nation. I'm not sure about Cuba at the moment, but definitely within the Anglophone Caribbean, Jamaica is the only one that has hosted an international heavyweight championship. In 1973, this was a joint effort with the government, and this was during the Michael Manley administration. It was between George Foreman and Joe Frazier, even though it was a brief encounter because Joe Frazier was knocked out pretty early. But the foundations of this, the association with political leaders like a Norman Manley, and then inherited by Michael Manley, and then later on the association with boxing as a nationalist. The association with nationalism. The association of boxing with nationalism, and how this became a distinct cultural product. So now we look at athletics and we look at, well, maybe not much cricket anymore, as extensions of ourselves in a nationalistic sense. Boxing was one of the premier ones in terms of that extension, identifying ourselves as a unique people, right? And this has to do with the manifestation of a boxing culture. So these are just some of the organizations that were responsible for organizing the sport, because remember, modern sport has to be organized effectively. We need the organizations to come to the fore as an indicator. I can't go into all the details now because of the time limits, so this is just an indication of them. These are some of the famous boxers during the period I am discussing. The major pioneer would be Dick Matthews from New Zealand. He was a heavyweight champion. Not from New Zealand, he was from America, but he became a heavyweight champion in New Zealand and was known as the Pacific Coast Wonder and so on. Other famous names you should look out for in this list is T.K. Wint. He's Jamaica's premier boxer. He helped to, in a local sense, to shape the boxing scene, especially the appreciation for physical culture, the idea of taking care of your body and so on, manifested in the schools and so on. Eliseo Quintana is another famous one from Cuba. He settled in Jamaica, died in 1945 thereabouts. So Herrera, the bone crusher, John Herrera, the bone crusher, and he also spent a significant portion of his life here in Jamaica as well. That reflects. So this is Dick Matthews, the man who started it all. A very obscure figure in the history of boxing generally, but he helped to jumpstart this idea of a boxing culture. That the appreciation for boxing and so on. Even though he was not a great boxer in the wider tradition, the wider historical sense of it all. And he was the one who started the tradition where the local scene would gain significant impetus from an external element. And this external element or external factor would generate a significant local impetus in the market, generate a buzz in the market. So the idea that an American would be coming here, or a Cuban would be coming here, or some foreigner would be coming here, would generate a buzz in within the local circles, generate a buzz in the market, and get people more willing to pay. And obviously it became a big issue, you know, going forward, you know, in terms of the lack of appreciation for our own local talent, and how that wasn't sufficient to generate that buzz. Hence why one of the main areas of enterprise was to seek foreigners from overseas to come to our stage and box for, you know, for prizes. This is TK Wint in 1916. He was a premier middleweight champion and physical culturist. And these are some of the famous promoters. Louis Winkler, obviously Lucien Chen, he died recently. He's the most recent one. Some names that we would know, Siagas, through Alfred Siaga. He was one of, many of them would have been merchants, the Souzas, the Silveras, and so on, Mike Hanna. These are also some of the famous venues in the Kingston area primarily. There were other venues outside of Kingston, but most of the major venues would have been in the Kingston region, especially the Ward Theatre. Before that, the Theatre Royal. Is there another famous one? The Melbourne Park, or the Melbourne Cricket Club grounds of the Rose Gardens would have been also a prominent one during this period. Edelweiss Park. Garvey was also big on boxing at the time. These venues were so prominent that because of the popularity of boxing, the first calls for a national stadium was associated directly with boxing, because they wanted a national stadium whereby they could accommodate all of these crowds for boxing events, right? It's basically based on the buzz that was generated by the boxing sector. Right, and also there was some association with some of our original cinemas. Palace Amusement didn't have much of an association with boxing, but other cinemas in competition did host boxing events at the time. Sport Park was one that, this was by Gore. Gore was the one who established Sport Park. That was one of the more popular grounds in the 1920s. Rose Gardens was also popular. It was so popular it could host up to 8,000 people. Lastly, one of the other major competitions during this period, we know about champs and so on, but one of our major competitions would have been the interscholastic boxing competition during this period, 1931 to 1941. It officially ended in 1950. These are the list of winners. Monroe and Wilmers would have been heads and shoulders apart from the rest. One or two to Calabar, Casey, and so on. This is the original Monroe boxing team of 1931. So this was one way that physical culture was able to manifest itself within the schools. So that's just a general overview. I couldn't get into most of the issues regarding this, obviously, because of the time. But just to say that in terms of expanding the horizon of our historical understanding of sport and its manifestation in Jamaican culture, right? I mean, we know about the other sports, but that's primarily because of the development since 1945. But in a foundational sense, boxing was one of the premier ones that contributed significantly to our appreciation of various cultural aspects of our development, especially the idea of physical culture. The other sports did it, but boxing was the premier one in terms of promoting the idea of a physical culture, healthy lifestyle, and those elements. And then obviously entertainment, enterprise, that would have also contributed to our idea of building creating this entertainment package. So now Jamaica is known as one of the premier entertainment destinations in the world. But before all of the fancy parties and so on, having a boxer with a fancy name, just like how we associate with the artists having fancy names and so on. Having a boxer with a fancy name, or two boxers with a fancy name going at it, was considered the premier entertainment package in Jamaica during this period. So that model would have carried over into the post-independence period. The idea of using monikers to promote yourself and so on and so forth, that began with the boxers in Jamaica, because they were part of a distinct entertainment product in the society. So this paper is just basically showing you, well, it's supposed to show outside of cricket, how other sports contributed to the nationalistic appeal in Jamaica, nationalistic and the various cultural manifestations in Jamaica outside of the realm of, say, cricket and so on. So this is just one way of expanding our understanding of sport in Jamaica, giving more, a better sense of it. So that's it for me today. So thanks for coming.
Karl, thank you so much. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about the nationalism that boxing engendered, apart from athletics in my mind and cricket. So that was actually way more interesting than I could have anticipated. So thank you.
Yes, because it's sports. Eh?
It's sports after all, and I do agree with one of your first statements about it being violent. That's always been my opinion, but you really brought another side to it. And I am glad that you're proceeding with that research, Karl. Okay, so as I would have said earlier, and for those who joined afterward, please continue with placing your questions in our chat. So for those who may not be too familiar, if you hover on your Zoom screen, chat is one of the options. And once you click on it, you have the option to send out your messages. And we will be collecting these. And at the end of both presentations, we will address them to the presenters and we'll allow your overall comments. So please continue to place your messages there. And with that said, so thanks again, Dr. Watts. We're going to now move on to our second presenter. Dr. Shani Roper is the curator of the University of the West Indies Museum and former research officer and acting director of Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, an entity under the Institute of Jamaica. Her research interests explore histories of Caribbean childhood, museums, education, sustainable heritage, development, and pedagogical approaches to the study of history. She has published articles on Afro-Jamaican childhood and social policy in Jamaica in the Journal of History of Childhood and Youth, Journal of Caribbean History, and Caribbean Studies. So with that said, I'd like to invite Dr. Roper. Let me quickly unmute your mic.
This clearly laid out state of being silenced are labeled across time and space as being rebellious, uncontrollable, and rude. This state is also found in the archive, where children's voices are written out of the sources on which we rely, newspapers, administrative records, and the like, and where their voices are represented, they're mediated and interpreted by adult voices. This is especially true where a child's voice and actions are reflected upon through an adult gaze, through in memoirs, for example, or in a commission of inquiry. The answer to the question, who is a child, is one that is in constant flux and changes based on time, geography, and cultural perception. For the purposes of this discussion today, I rely on definitions assigned to categories of youthfulness in Jamaica for the period under review. So under the Industrial Schools and Reformatories Act of 1881, a child is defined as anyone under the age of 14 years, but with specific reference to those 7 and under as being defined as incapable of making decisions because their personalities are not yet formed. This is reinforced under the Young Criminals Offenders Act of 1904 that allowed parents to be charged for a child's crime. Juvenile offenders are those defined as 12 to 16 years of age under the 1897 Juvenile Offenders Law. These laws are instrumental because they provide pathways for children to be institutionalized as wards of the state. Majority of the children criminalized during this period are Black boys in urban areas who were considered disruptive and uncontrollable as they fought, threw stones, swore, and gathered in public spaces. Children in rural areas were often convicted of predial larceny or larceny and then sent to reformatories in Kingston to serve their time. How does the study of the lives and experiences of children change our understanding of Caribbean societies? And how would such studies alter our understanding of power, agency, and the development of socio-economic and welfare policies? Centering children in our investigation of the Jamaican past provides an opportunity to review our understanding of power dynamics, i.e. dominance versus subservience, resistance versus agency, or even the very nature of the archive. So this short presentation focuses on the lives of children housed in the government industrial school and reformatory between 1869 and 1899, and with specific reference to the 1870s commissions of inquiry into rumors of abuse, violence, and disfigurement on the grounds of the institution. The Government Reformatory and Industrial School was established in 1869 after the closure of the Kingston and St. Andrew Reformatory for girls and the St. George's Home and Reformatories for boys, which were established 1857 and 58 respectively, right after the passage of the first Industrial Schools Act. For contemporary reference, so that you have a sense of where the Government Reformatory was located, first, it was known as the Approved School from the 1950s. So it's now the location of the Hart NTA compound in Stony Hill near the police station. In 1869, the institution housed a total of 168 boys and 71 girls and adapted an agricultural-based program which saw children's labor being deployed in agriculture, laundry work, as well as construction on both the institutional grounds and for public use. And the children housed at these institutions, at this specific institution, was called inmates. And a similar term is used for Alpha Boys, Alpha Cottage, when it was in 1881 it was established, as well as the Belmont Orphanage that was established in the 1890s and closed in the early 1920s. Now, I'm not doing a full-fledged PowerPoint, but what I'm going to do is start out with an image and then speak to my presentation during that point. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Abandoned in the 1950s, the old military barracks was transformed into a rugged garbage heap and goat pen. The staff moved the children from Kingston, which is the previous institutions, to the new compound without the grounds being cleaned. The first superintendent, Reverend H.P.C. Melville of the Church of England, assumed control of the newly established government reformatory between 1869 and 1874. And according to Melville, Governor Sir Peter Grant informed him that the institution was not to be conceived as a prison, but rather an institution catering to displaced children in need of education and guidance. Reverend Melville developed a regimental industrial education program, and industrial here refers to agriculture as well as the supporting trade industries for agriculture for the period. And so that includes like tailoring, mason work, blacksmith work, and so on. And these programs were designed to effectively harness the labor of the children. The boys worked a total of 12 hours a day, regardless of the weather. Inmates woke at 5 a.m., were given sugar and water, tidied their beds, went to the fields. At 9:30, they received breakfast, after which half went to school, half returned to the trade shops or fields. They received a loaf of bread at 12:15, returned to their employment by 1:15. At 4 in the evening, boys in the trade shops went to the fields to work until 5 and vice versa. An hour later, they were served dinner. They were served to the barrack. They returned to the barracks at dusk, where they retired for the evening until at 7:30 p.m. The girls were kept secluded from boys, but they labored as seamstresses and laundresses to the institution and the wider community while they worked in the field. This regimented system ideally was to encourage discipline and respect for authority. And even though gender influenced the ways in which work was allocated, it was clear that laboring was an essential part of the daily lives of children living there. The program was considered successful, as produce sold at Market in Kingston sustained the institution, and on the service created good, diligent laborers. By the time Reverend Pierce assumed the position of superintendent in 1875, the reformatory reported that it had produced 2,570 banana trees, 1,360 plantain trees, 4,136 coffee trees, 2 acres of cane, half an acre of cocoa under cultivation. What is the impact of such a regimented system, and how did administrators deal with children who refuse to work? And this is where the Commission of Inquiry comes into being, and it's important in our understanding of children's daily lives and their existence. In the first decade, the reformatory's existence was contentious, as rumors circulated of general mismanagement and the disfigurement of inmates on the institution. Contemporary reports suggest that the government failed to rehabilitate the structure prior to the arrival of the children. The floors of the North Barracks, which housed the boys, were covered in goat feces. The walls were covered in lice and chigoe. And the 2 inquiries set up by Governor William Gray and Anthony Musgrave, respectively, in 1875 and 1877, found evidence of cruel and capricious punishment by staff members, and concluded that the institution lacked the infrastructure to cater to the personal hygiene and public sanitation. And so the first rumor was reported by in the colonial office records. Mr. Abraham Hyam, who was a citizen living in Stony Hill, wrote to Governor Gray to say that there was a disease attacking the lower extremities of the boys in an epidemic-like manner since February of 1870. He estimated that as a result of the outbreak, there were over 200 amputations of toes at the institution. And the Governor Gray, concerned, launched an investigation that then revealed that there were a series of reports from the senior medical officers who visited the institution, indicating that there was a disease, a mass kind of outbreak of disease on the institution. In the end, or by the time the commission had ended, they identified that what the children were actually suffering from was a chigoe infestation. Now, the children, more specifically boys, did not wear shoes, nor were they given shoes during their stay, and they spent almost all their time working on the grounds. Very often, they were cut by sharp glass or stones in the soil, and then they retreated to dorms that were infested with lice. They bathed twice a week in a tank where they shared bath water and bathed in the river on Sundays. And they were provided very limited health care. Many of the cuts, as I said before, became infested by a vermin mite that's known colloquially as chigoe or chink. And in the face of repeated infection, the boys' toes were amputated. One on-site doctor, Dr. Karl, racialized his diagnosis by concluding that this disease, which, and they had a separate name for it, was specific to Afro-Jamaicans, despite the fact that Melville, who is the first superintendent of European descent, his son also developed ulcers that were infested by chigoe. So focusing on the conditions in which they lived, the commissioners solicited testimony from 3 inmates, 2 of which lived at Stony Hill, who had left, and then a current inmate. So one of them was Francis Grant, 1868 to 1873, Edward Sims, 1870 to 1875. That's a period, that's not their lifetimes when they lived on the institution, and a current inmate, Alexander Berry. So what I want to just pause here and say is that this is something that's very unusual for the period, especially for the English-speaking Caribbean. You do not find children or young or juveniles or youth speaking directly to officials, and especially Afro-Jamaican children. So the fact that we have 3 out of 170 speaking is very important, because even though their words are written down by whoever is the secretary of the commission, the fact is still that their ideas were represented, right? So their testimony not only corroborated witness testimony of staff members, but also provided a detailed narrative of the lives of children at the institution, and as well as the use of punishment, more specifically flogging, shackling, and the introduction of bread and water diet in regulating both the bodies of boys and girls. Unfortunately, by speaking only to boys, the institution actually silences the experiences of girls living there. The findings of the report condemned the colonial state, as it revealed that the school administrators, and more specifically the superintendent, who was from the Creole white religious population, failed to make adequate provisions for the children housed there. And actually, and just to kind of summarize here, that they were actually some of the more aggressive users of physical violence. So one of the issues with Melville was that he would chain the children. So it's a military barrack, so the cells are still there. So they would house the children underground as in isolation as part of punishment, and then they would shackle them together for days at a time. So we have one specific issue where Francis Grant went as far in his testimony to say, "I have known as many as 3 and 4 shackled together for 2 to 3 months at a time. Sundays they were loosened. They got sore legs sometimes. A boy named Barber got a sore from being shackled." And so this is something that's reinforced repeatedly to everyone, reinforced throughout the commission, right? Now, so this reveals these testimonies around violence, punishment, and the use of historical tools of oppression and torture have revealed several issues about the culture of work at the reformatory. So one of them is this, right? Because with the outbreak of disease on the institution, the amputations did not alter the work culture of the institution. The crisis revealed differing interpretations about debility, which is weakness, and disability, which is not having full functioning limbs, right? And its impact on the child's ability to work. And the conflict around these things caused significant issues between Reverend Melville, as well as the medical professionals taking care of the children. And so all 3 boys testified that Melville habitually sent children out with sores to work in the field. And in one case, Dr. Cargill openly protested when Melville removed another boy, Charles Roden, from the hospital to run errands 10 miles away in Kingston, even though he suffered from sores. Dr. Cargill, like other medical officials, felt that disability, such as sores on feet or amputated toes, was reason enough to stop work on the compound, which Melville disagreed. Now, this is partly because the government, the colonial government, expected these institutions to be self-sufficient. So if they're not self-sufficient, then they're an excessive cost on government, right? And what we know today is that institutions taking care of wards to the state are very expensive. So that is why you've had a move away from institutionalization. So the children, so with the conflict takes place in front of the children, and in response, you start to have children resisting the efforts of Melville and other staff members. So Cotter went as far as to inform Melville that the children under his care are his responsibility. And but Melville then uses force such as flogging to force children to agree to their position. So the punishments reflect this kind of historic relationship between tools of oppression, shackles, whipping as a way of social control. And so you find the report being littered with these kinds of narrative. There are other issues, for example, the use of food as a way of control. So children were fed bread and water as punishment. And very often you find that this would go on for extended periods. The Commission of Inquiry had ruled that the current system couldn't work, and they had put in policies at border visitors to prevent this from happening. But then you had another 1877 commission that occurs in response to the to another rumor of boys stealing from members within the Stony Hill community. And that report found that Mr. Roos, who is now another Creole white Jamaican, was actually shackling the boys again. And when Commissioner said, you can't be shackling the boys like dogs, he says, if I had a cage, I would lock them in it, because that's the only way to stop them from running away. Now, if we think about running away as an act of resistance and agency, then we see children exercising an option that's available to them. Because when you look at the issues around power dynamics, which is that a child in response to an adult is supposed to be subservient and dependent, which means that the adult is always in a position of power. How does a child respond to an adult who then has tools of oppression, whipping, shackling, and solitary confinement and bread and water? How does a child respond to that? And so running away becomes very important. At the end of the commissions, the Jamaican administration decides that the Jamaican Creole white population, as well as ministers, right, are not fit. We're not fit. And so I'm not concluding this. This is a statement that's made in the colonial records in correspondence with the colonial office in the United Kingdom, that the Creole white population has failed to distance themselves 40, 50 years after slavery to stop mobilizing these tools that are really associated with control and violence from slavery. And so from at that point, the government industrial school specifically, which runs from 1869 to the 1980s, late 1970s, early 80s, and by that time it's known as approved school, so it's lasted a long time, but between 69 and at least 39, the government only has white men from the United Kingdom trained in reformatories to come and run this specific institution. It was the only secular institution in the island, catering to the island at the time. We had Alpha, Belmont, you have several others. Wortley Home is 1916 or 1919. Maxfield Park is 1919. Rio Cobre is 1919 as well. So all of these homes that come after were actually allocated to particular religious and sociocultural groups. But the government industrial school and reformatory was the premier institution to house wards of the state. And it was considered non-secular, non-religious, non-denominational rather, and non-denominational, and had close ties with the reformatory movement in the United Kingdom by hiring. What this study does is that it changes our understanding around how policies run in Jamaica and affect the lives of persons, children living as wards of the state. The other thing too is that the children that you can actually speak about clearly are the wards of the state, and that there are some cultural issues around trying to speak to the lives of children in Jamaica. It requires a lot of speculation, right? So you have to make a lot of educated guesses about why this and not that. And so it requires a lot of research, but it also requires a lot of rethinking of how we engage silenced voices in the archive. And it requires, as another scholar has said, for us to read against the grain of the archive, right? About how to conceptualize what happens to marginalized and silenced groups in Caribbean society. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to our conversations for the remainder of the time.
Indeed, Shani, wow, there's so much that I think this could go on so much. This was really heartrending. Thank you so much for that. Wow. There are a lot of comments going on now. and I will try to collate them as best as possible. Karl, are you there? We've got a few for you. I'd give yours first. Karl? Karl, are you there?
Yeah, I was waiting for permission. So.
Okay, so I've got a few questions. I'm going to just give you them back word for word. The first one, and I'll allow you to answer, and then we move on to the next. How did the clash of nationalism and foreign boxers promoters manifest in the Jamaican culture? And how suitable were the various venues for boxing? So can you say any more about the venues? Those are your first two questions, Karl.
Well, just to point out, maybe I should have emphasized it a bit more. Most of the promoters were local, were locally based. One of the reasons why boxing has fell off, I interviewed Leroy Brown from the Jamaica Boxing Board of Control, and he's one of the premier writers on boxing history before whatever. But he was saying that our lack of a local boxing promoting class is one of the reasons that has led to the decline of the sport. In my period, we had a strong local boxing, local promoting class. So that was one of the reasons why the sport was alive and well. So it actually, because it was a locally, most of the promoters or the top promoters were local. This allowed for us to, in a nationalistic sense, this allowed for us to have these kind of arrangements along amateur and prize fighting lines, because yes, the amateurs were primarily prize fighting in terms of the primarily for prize fighting, because they were more, they were geared towards making a profit. But because of the association with the nationalistic movement that was taking place at the time, you found that there was some crossover, especially when the Jamaican Boxing Board of Control had initiated some various initiatives of the Jamaica Boxing Board of Control. They did rely on the support of the local promoters, especially at D'Souza or Silvera or later on Lucien Chen in the 1930s. They would rely on them for support in terms of organizing these amateur events, getting our athletes to these major sporting events like the Panama Games, or that was known as the Panama Olympics at the time. So yeah, there was a significant crossover between the promoters and the local organizers of the sport to get several initiatives off the ground. Regarding the other question regarding venues, most of them were considered suitable. One of the things with the history of boxing is that you have War Theatre would have been one of the premier, what the premier venues before would have been established houses that were not necessarily associated with boxing. So for instance, the War Theatre was a prominent venue. The Theatre Royal before that, and then you had like for instance, the Melbourne Cricket Grounds, right? These were venues that were established outside of boxing, but then eventually became associated with boxing. Now, the suitability of other venues that would have emerged came with when the War Theatre decided to not host boxing events for a while because of its association with violence and so on and so forth. For instance, a policeman was there getting beat up and the crowd was cheering on his opponent to continue beating up the policeman and so on. So these were the kind of events that where the promoters, where the War Theatre management, they felt that they no longer wanted to host boxing events. And what this led to is a sort of privatization of the sport and the creation of venues that were designed explicitly for boxing. So these venues, most of them were in what we consider now the downtown area. It was very spacious at the time. It was to accommodate several thousands comfortably. So it was considered suitable in a certain sense, especially when you go beyond Kingston and you look at other venues that would have been established that would have allowed for, you know, accommodation of several thousands of spectators, and there were hardly any complaints because many of these venues were very large. So I think that answers the question.
Before I get to the next question, Karl, do any of these venues, I don't know if your research has gone there as yet, but do any of these venues still exist, and are they still being utilized for boxing?
None of them. Well, if you count the War Theatre, but that is down, so the War Theatre was a prominent one, but most of the prominent ones, because even look at the Lyric Theatre in Port Antonio, that was a venue in Port Antonio, but when you look up at the history of theatre in general, there's no record of the Lyric at all. No one did any research into that theatre. No one knows what became of it. But it's because of my research into boxing that I came across this this particular theatre. So most of them are not in existence. Well, apart from our theatre, which is still standing.
Okay. Okay, Karl. So the next question is a comment from Professor Robertson. So his comments are intriguing foundations for your study. And if you could explore how these activities were described in Jamaica's newspapers and magazines, or have you? For example, the Gleaner's online index may give you a start for chronology, but rummaging the Jamaica Times or magazines like Planter's Punch might complement the accounts of fights, reports of the boxing board, and school committee meetings and obituaries. Don't just look at these accounts for the what of events, but think about the adjectives applied. Do they shift by color or class or situation, and do they shift over time? So that's a comment for you, Karl. Do you want to respond?
Well, suffice to say that well, this is a foundational sort kind of research. I'm aware of Professor Robertson's or Prof. Robertson's comments from a previous presentation of this paper, or not the paper, this topic here. Yes, I have looked through the newspapers and so on, and based on the general information that's presented and the use of newspapers in boxing history in general, I am aware of the use that this is the primary source in terms of generated information. And he did indicate the use of magazines as well, and so on, and that is a fair point. So
I have another question too. I was drawn to your presentation, particularly when you spoke about interscholastic boxing.
I just put that in there.
You
no,
just
no. It was an important initiative of the Jamaica Boxing Board of Control. It was one way to legitimize sport, especially the idea of physical culture.
Because does anything like that exist anymore apart from a few?
After 1950, they ended it. For various.
In 1950.
Right, because
why did they say it?
Huh?
Why was it ended?
Well, I guess because it wasn't not many in terms of participation. It wasn't as effective as the other sporting events. So it didn't make sense for them to continue. Well, according to them, with the enterprise.
Okay.
Right. But it was one of the more proper ones, but the participants were very few from the 1930s going on. Only a few schools had that established boxing culture.
Okay. Well, thank you, Karl, so far. I'll just continue monitoring the chat to see if there are any other questions to be directed at you. I'm going to move across to Shani. Our first question is, would it be possible to track the outcomes for any of those children when they became adults? Does your research extend to that, Shani?
So, so this project was a subset of my dissertation. I And one of the things that I found is, so the nature of the archive is that you have a kind of abundance of records from the 1860s to about 1938. And then you have the kind of the streamlining of institutionalization of children according to international standards. So that became now an issue where you wouldn't have been able to go into the archive and actually find a record tracing the movement of children. One of the issues that affects children who become wards of the state that is not specific to this period is that it's extremely difficult to track outcomes. Very often they leave the institution and then they just kind of disappear. After I had finished my dissertation, I spoke to one or two other persons who came out of the Maxfield Park Children's Home. And that is a very the history of that institution is very interesting because it was originally managed by the Kingston and St. Andrew Corporation. And when compared, so this is my thinking, if you had a choice of which institution you could end up in, your best choices would be the Alpha homes, because Alpha had both a boys and a girls home. So your best bet is the Alpha homes or the government industrial school. Thereafter, the quality of life of a child in state care begins to break down, because those institutions, by the time you come to the 1930s, have a very clearly laid out program that is actually competing with schools in the mainstream education system. So if you wanted to get a good education as well as tools of trade that would allow you to pursue a business upon leaving the state's care at age 16, then you would need to go to Alpha or the government industrial school. All the others were orphanages that were named industrial schools because there is a kind of tension between this discussion about rehabilitation and the role of the child in the future development of a nation. And so a lot of it is just on paper, but not effectively implemented at the institutional level.
Thank you, Shani. I wanted to kind of put this question, just a point of clarification before the next question I have for you. You had mentioned that your research was your focus was 1869 to 1890s with the 1870s issues highlighted. How further did your research go, or how much beyond the 1890s?
My research goes up to 1938.
Great. So with that now, I'm going to ask how much change has happened in these homes since the time frame you are presenting on, which you kind of mentioned just now. But
so this is something that is in flux. Somebody mentioned the Armadale fire. So the inquiry into the Armadale fire occurred while I was writing the final chapter of this dissertation. And the report wasn't necessarily in the public's hand, but I got access to it because of somebody knew I was working on this topic. Now, some of the issues that were in the Armadale fire, which are issues around overcrowding, issues of discipline, and things like that. The Jamaican system, even though it is ahead of the Caribbean in terms of policy and legislation, is a system that's grounded in the 1857 legislation, right? What has happened, and this also has happened with poor relief, because Jamaica operates under the same poor relief legislation, even though the Board of Supervision was recently closed in the last 5 years, but Jamaica still operates under the 1886 law, even though we have multiple systems of social intervention and relief happening, right? So the Jamaican system around the welfare for those who are in extreme poverty, because that's what poor relief covers, not people who are about to become really poor and need intervention, those who have absolutely no clear resources available to them, as well as wards of the state, is actually grounded in the values associated with the 1850 law, 1857 Industrial Schools Act, and the 1886 Poor Relief Law. And what has happened is that we've constructed a system that operates in response to issues on the ground. So they may say, okay, we promote family engagement, but you don't change the actual structure. Things are changing now because the issues facing persons, social workers, and persons who face, and I don't work in that field, but the issues facing them today are distinctly different. So for example, there was recently a presentation that in my period, the child that is considered uncontrollable is a boy. In this period, the child that's considered uncontrollable is a girl, right? And so the things that have, and now the state has moved farther away from the wholesale institutionalization of children. Even though we still have institutions that are supposed to be holding uncontrollable / children in conflict with the law, they're not necessarily, that's not where my understanding of the CD and such institutions, that's not the policy that they're spearheading. And when you look comparatively, some of the policies, a lot of our policies are reactionary. I think what would work best is for us to look at what are the actual needs and how do we create a structure. Are children who are uncontrollable truly uncontrollable? I think that's an issue that continues to be at hand now.
Thank you, Shani. I appreciate especially you're saying that the reality for social workers is indeed different. And a comment here that Philippa Davis made, that the culture of institutionalizing children with emotional and behavioral issues is still existing, rings true to that. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And also my thought as you were running through your presentation was based on your saying that in that first decade of their reformatories, they were the public view of them was as that horrid place as it really sounded to be. Will your research probably consider how persons will now view, or how persons now view a reformatory? Is it still considered? Is there any change to really families wanting their children
when
there?
when people talk about Rio Cobre, the Rio Cobre institution was originally created as an orphanage for children of men who were orphaned because their fathers fought in World War I, right? So that was the original reason for the Rio Cobre home. And it was then changed to be an industrial school for boys under the age of 7 in response to the overwhelming number of boys in the system, right? And I want to say, though, that when they say overwhelming, the number of children in the industrial school system, when you come to the 1920s and 30s, is less than 1,500 children. The number of children on poor relief, because institutionalization in an industrial school is a subset of poor relief, right? The number of children who are on poor relief, either as individual recipients or as children of mothers who are recipients of poor relief, is numbering into the 3,000 to 5,000. And you can't even take that number seriously, because by the time you get to the 1930s, and we're talking about the Frome riots and extensive economic unemployment, the number of people who are in need of significance is support rather in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Well, tens or hundreds of thousands, because the Jamaican population is about 1 million, coming to 1 million at that time. So when you think about this subset, this is a very small subset. But to manage poor relief, that includes assistance for persons who were in what we now formerly know as Bellevue, right? And children who are wards of the state. took up something like 55% of every parish council funding. So the system was extremely inefficient and expensive to maintain. So people looked at it more. I'll use the image, for example, so I can answer the question. When you look at the image, what you actually see are boys in what look like prison uniform, right? Now, how do you explain to people that you're creating a school if the pitney them look like them in a prison? And parents know that you want their children's labor. You want to keep them just minimally educated so that they remain as dependents within Jamaica's economic system that is heavily dependent on agriculture. You can't convince them, says a school. So till this day, Rio Cobre Home is known as the reformatory, right? And when people talk about the Stony Hill Institution and talk about the approved school, because it was always seen as a criminal institution for children who were criminal, when really a lot of the children there, in part of my research was to actually trace, you can trace how many coming in as destitute because of the nature of the funding and how many coming in conflict with the law. And majority of the children that went into the reformatory and industrial school were children who were in need of care and protection, who were destitute.
Wow. Thanks, Shani. I'm gonna just quickly give you, I think I have another question for Karl. I'm gonna give you a little break, Shani. Karl.
Shani, good man, Shani, good.
Shani is gonna just sip a bit of water, Karl. Karl, someone was interested in, I don't remember if you had expanded in the introductory part of your presentation into the different areas of sport that your research would be going. Someone particularly asked if you were looking into cycling in Jamaica.
No, this article is just about boxing because it was one of the more popular sports during the period, along with horse racing and cricket. Cycling there as well, along with football and the others, but they never gained the traction that cricket, boxing, and horse racing got. So at the moment, I'm just focusing on, well, there's enough has been said about cricket, so I'm trying to expand it now into one of the other popular sports, which would be boxing. But cycling, I'm aware of cycling and how prominent it was at the time as well.
So possible research in the future.
Well, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. I will look again if there are any more questions for Karl, but Shani, I was also asked, we were asked, was there a separate St. Andrew home for girls between 1877 and 1885? You're muted.
I'm muted here, not on the computer.
Okay.
I'm muted in my microphone. So the practice internationally was that you would, well, in the English speaking out of Europe, is that you'd house boys in one institution and girls in one institution. From as far back as the 1840s, where the first institution to house children was developed in Antigua, right? So for as far back as the 1840s, in the Caribbean, we have tried to replicate that, but in Jamaica, boys and girls are housed on the same grounds, right? So the problem with the government reformatory is that girls, in another paper that I've written on Black girls, in state care, the girls were something like 13% of that overall population. So when you get to 1911, the population at the government reformatory is something like 350 to 400 children, but only 50 of that number is girls, right? And one of the issues that happens is that the colonial officials complain that judges were releasing girls into the community because they almost inevitably, when they were brought before the court, there is someone who is willing to come out on their behalf to say, I will take this girl. Rather, the boys were just kind of scooped up en masse and they were just, you know, they're found loitering in the bus park. They're found fighting at the race course, or all of those things are part of it. So yes, there are institutions for girls. They're on the same grounds. In fact, at the government reform, which in the same period, Melville beat. So Grant Berry and the other young man, they actually don't like Melville. And I would say it's because Melville beat them because they had been found corresponding with a girl also on the ground. So the girls were kept in one location on the grounds and the boys were kept in another location. And so being in communication, like writing letters, right? To like little letters back and forth was enough to be beaten. So you know that what the problem with the narrative is that you can't figure out like how relationships were constructed. How do you have discussions around sexuality? There was another case where the girls had complained about a hermaphrodite on the grounds who had snuck into the girls' dorm and had terrorized them. And then the doctors had come in and examined the young boy and said that he was not a hermaphrodite, it's just that he was so small that he can't be seen as somebody, whatever. But what that example tells you is that there are these discussions around intimacy, sexuality, sexual violence, and so on, that the children living on the grounds have very clear ideas about it, right? But you can't find out those information because you can't respond to it, because that the archive is not constructed in that manner. So you can only speculate about what could have happened.
Thanks, Shani. So much to think about. The
Wortley home.
Well, that one. There's one before that. So now that we know this information, how do we move forward? What are your recommendations for similar projects that seek to decolonize history? What can be done with that information?
Well, I think the demand of decolonization is really for us to change to change the positionality of how investigation takes place. So I think in the Caribbean, we spend a lot of time thinking about the big people, right? But in reality, a lot of what happens on the ground is not the same that the big people speak about. So if we think about the 1950s and we think about what independence means, right? We have a particular narrative. We have some dates that are tied to the construction of the Jamaican nation state. But did independence transform the socioeconomic condition and spaces of the people who are the the average Jamaican, right? So for me, I think we need to start what decolonization I think requires in this process is a fleshing out, as Karl was saying, of the society as a whole. And there are major areas. I would suggest people can start with Moore and Johnson's 2-volume history, cultural history, sociocultural history of Jamaica. Karl, what name again?
Neither Led Nor Driven.
Neither Led Nor Driven. That came out. I remember that one. Yeah, 2014, 2004 rather, because that came out while I was doing my master's. And those texts, they push the traditional timelines associated with the construction of Jamaican history. So for example, their history stops in 1920, and they theorize that Jamaican society and culture was one of contention and negotiation, right? But but they will have to do that kind of additional investigation, because they talk about the violence on the children on the street, and they also talk about the references to parents abusing children, the types of punishments entailed. That also comes up in the government industrial school and reformatory. So there is actually some research to be done around these discussions of the protection of the children. Who sets the policy, and how are we engaging the the tensions that exist. Another important part is the history of the Black family in Black majority contexts. So Jemmy Jamot's work on ties that bind is an important intervention. So I suggest people who are interested in expanding and rethinking historical narratives. It also means that because the history is the present past, you can bring a historical narrative right up to the 1980s, for example, right? Because there's some hindsight, there's some negotiation, and there are things, and history is always in flux, so there's always this opportunity for review and response. So it's just a little creativity.
Would you say, Shani, that the reformatories that these care facilities have mostly been punitive rather than reformatory?
So the question, I think we have to problematize reforming, the act of reforming, and the act of rehabilitation. What are we defining as being reformed? What are we defining as rehabilitated, right? I mean, the intent, are right, and how, well, I mean, I would say, yes, they are punitive, right? But at the same time, we still have to problematize these words that we use very loosely when we are characterizing people and personal experiences, right? So when they are speaking about rehabilitation in 1869, which is 4 years after Morant and we know that there are sweeping changes to the Jamaican legal and policy framework, right? Post Morant Bay, the assembly is dissolved and so on. What does rehabilitation mean in that post Morant Bay context? Right? And rehabilitation there means children need to become laborers because they form a planter class that then becomes oligarchy, is actually controlling the economy. The governors rely on them to guide them in policy decisions. So rehabilitation then is always tied to the old racial contract that the post-emancipation rich person wants to maintain. Right? So we really have to problematize those kinds of terms that we use.
All right, Shani, thank you. I'm going to give you a break again as we are entering the home stretch of our webinar. But I have another one for Karl. My apologies. I did copy this. This was the first question that came out. My apologies.
Another one?
So this was the first question. So that's what was the impact of Bonnie Grant, who won a Commonwealth title in 1962?
Oh, I haven't reached a Bonnie Grant as yet, unfortunately, because I stopped at 1945, right? But he would have been a part of the nationalistic movement that would have emerged in 1945, along with athletics, along with cricket, and so on. Within that space, within the Jamaican space, but this is really a part one of a part two. I do it to actually expand the research beyond 1945, but I thought prudent or focus on the foundational aspects of the sport from 1892 to 1940. Get to Bonnie Grant and those people.
Thanks, Karl. That question had actually triggered another thought in my head when you had mentioned Jamaica being a leisure market. I was struck by that. I didn't think of Jamaica. I knew at that period there was
when I said leisure market, I meant that there was a leisure market, especially for the middle class at the time. So the idea of the dance hall and so on, that was around in this time as well.
Okay.
Like for example, in terms of the boxing entertainment package, what you have is that just like how we have, like the after party thing. So after the big boxing event, clubs now would advertise that, all right, after boxing you can come through, buy your drinks and discuss some boxing or what, the aftermath of a particular event and so on. So it was very connected, and it was linked to that boxing, to the boxing place in the nighttime.
So what made it that we had other Caribbean people coming here feeling so attracted to coming to Jamaica to
right, because we had one of the biggest markets for boxing, how much boxers would have been paid during the time. But at the time. So along with Panama and Cuba, Jamaica, within the Circle region, as I tried to, well, I couldn't really dwell on it. Those three territories within the Circum-Caribbean were the prominent spaces for at the time. So Jamaica would be one destination for boxers, along with Panama, along with Cuba. Lara Putnam was the first person to actually write about this transnational migration of the boxers. So I'm just expanding on that by one particular venue in detail. Jamaica, obviously. So.
Okay, you're breaking up a little bit. Thank you, Karl. So I'm not sure if this is our last question for you, Shani, but that Wortley home in Constant Spring, how were the girls there treated? It is understood that in the early days, girls who had become pregnant with unwanted children were dispatched to the Wortley home. Did that population of girls only house those the middle classes?
Yes. So this is there's a class and a race dimension. So when the Wortley home catered to middle class girls, and initially it was for East Indian girls, and then it became middle class / upper middle class, and then since then it has gone through multiple evolutions. Also, it was originally said it was originally the Wortley home for East Indian girls, because when they officially ended the Indian migration of Indians so when the last ship came in 1917, the Department of Immigration had orphaned East Indian children who were in their care of protection, who then had to go into the care and protection of the Board of Supervision, which is under for poor relief, right? And so the Wortley home, which was, if I remember, is it Anglican or Presbyterian? I think it's Anglican. I can't remember. No. But the Wortley home was Anglican. Thank you. The Wortley home was specifically developed for a middle class community. The other home that catered to East Indian children was the Swift home, which then became I can't remember now. The Swift home is 1923. It became an industrial school. It then combined to become the Swift Purcell home. So all of these homes have an evolution, and it started out as a home for East Indian children as well. So I remember early on a long-serving administrator said, "Oh, you're talking about those institutions." No, man, I'm talking about the institutions after 1951, which is when they have the proper legislation governing it, the contemporary. And I was like, but 1951 didn't actually change anything. But, yeah, so the homes, these institutions undergo significant change. And so they were also popping up everywhere because the government started offering some level of subsidization to churches to provide for children in conflict with the law or in need of care and protection.
Thanks, Shani, indeed. I just wanted to make a few comments or highlight a few comments, thanking both presenters because the topics really have stimulated a lot of discussion and engagement. We are also being encouraged as a society to continue events such as this, that the populace can be properly stimulated and at least know where to go and find information, and not to grab everything as it's being fed. Let me see. Yes, thanks are being submitted. Information is fascinating. Comments such as that. We have a comment here from Ms. Thomas. Something she finds interesting in researching her own families, how Jamaican families moved from slavery to being landowners. I guess that's something else that further research, or another topic that we could discuss further down. As we had said, it's a series of webinars that the society will be hosting. So just those few comments. And I think that is it. I'm not seeing anything else. Let me just check my other list right here, that I didn't miss anything. Yes. So Shani and Karl, thank you so much indeed, engaging. I feel a little sad having been given that. I was pumped up from Karl's presentation, and then I'm like, wow, the 1800s were rough for us. But we need to know these things. We need to appreciate where we're coming from. Yes, Karl?
Somebody saying the question wasn't answered.
Tell me, where is that? Shani Roper.
Chantal, yeah.
Chantal. Let me look again. My apologies, Chantal. That would have been me.
Assuming this was Shani.
Whatever.
I'm sifting through. I must have missed it.
Could she retype her question?
Could you paste it again? I'm scrolling through a lot of comments, Chantal. I missed it. So if you could just type it again. Just paste, copy and paste.
Oh, she's trying to find it.
But I'm trying to find it too. I don't.
It never came through.
I think I remember seeing something from that person.
Oh, there's a question. There was also a question for Lorraine based on, is it safe to say children being placed in state care has largely been, oh, you did ask for that.
Yes, I kind of summarized it
okay.
instead. You might have to just type it again, Chantal, because I'm not finding it. Sorry.
Oh, okay. How do we move forward?
I think I had to ask that question.
Yeah, you did ask a variation.
Yes, we did ask. What are your recommendations for projects that seek to...
I did answer it.
Yes, she did answer it.
Oh, so she said that she got kicked off. So basically, I just said that I was suggesting using Moore and Johnson's Neither Led Nor Driven as a pivot point to look at the areas. That's a two volume text looking that's basically argues that culture in Jamaica was one of negotiation and contention. And so I was suggesting that as a pivot point because there are these extensive areas that fall outside of the timeline that's established for Jamaican history that can be used to explore. I also suggested that people should consider doing more contemporary research as well, which is histories from the 1980s and so on that really inform our engagement with our society today.
Thank you, Shani. Thank you so much. I think we can definitely say that with the discussion so far, there is clearly a lot still to go on, still to be highlighted. And this is what we really wanted to have from our sessions, and going forward, we'll try as best as possible to continue this. So I think we are at the end of our program, and with that, I would like to invite our president again, Elizabeth, to offer thanks. You can go ahead, Elizabeth. I hope you're unmuted. No? Let me quickly find your name. Are you able to unmute yourself, Elizabeth? Or I have to unmute you?
You have to do it.
Okay.
You can go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to say I am a very happy person today that we actually pulled off this webinar. I want to say thanks to my fabulous colleagues who are on the executive committee of our society, for the background work in making this possible, and for two of them to actually be the presenters today. So very big thanks to Dr. Shani Roper for her very eye-opening, if heart-rending, exploration of the history of less fortunate children in Jamaica, and to Dr. Karl Watts for helping us to understand other aspects of how Jamaica's cultural identity has been formed, especially through boxing, of which I have to say I tend to have had zero interest in before, Karl, but no, it's spiked up on a scale of 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's reached to 5.
Well done.
And, you know, the question about the venues, you know, my big interest is buildings and architecture. And you mentioned the venues, and that's a whole intriguing part of it. So thank you very much, both of you. Thanks to our attendees. We couldn't do it without you being here, and we hope you will be with us and bring your friends as we have future webinars. Just to say a couple quick words about our theme. I think both presenters in quite different ways raised such important points. One of the things Dr. Roper said, if I'm not misquoting, is that we're still being governed by laws that were developed in the 19th century. Where have we reached in the decolonizing of our minds, our attitudes, the way in which things were defined and going forward? So there are many things for us to think about as we look at how historical narrative is developed. And we look forward to seeing you all and more in our future webinars and possible online field trip, if not actual field trip. Thanks again, everyone. And to Bernadette, thank you for hosting and communicating with the members on our behalf.
You're welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you to my behind the scenes aide right now, Mrs. Nicole Prof, for your assistance with the flyer, as well as prompting me to the questions. So she's behind the scenes and doing a good job. Thank you so much. We are at the end of our session. You're free to open your videos so everybody can see who you are, and just say a brief hello to the rest of the attendees as we wrap up. That was quick, Professor Roberts. So wow.
But they're not saying anything. They're waving.
Hello, Georgia.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karl. You did a great job. All right, with that, we're going to end our meeting, and please listen out, follow our Facebook pages. Our Facebook page will be putting out our next webinar announcement very soon. Thank you for taking the time out to join us. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming.